Hello, this is cjhoyle. In this video I'm going to attempt to upgrade the brakes on my 1992 Iowa Linear Recumbent bike. About a year ago I made a video about this bike where I showed a number of upgrades that I had recently done to it. The most significant one was this reinforcing aluminum plate which I had someone weld onto the bike. At the time I had also been planning on upgrading the brakes since I'd never been very happy with these ones. I purchased a pair of these brakes, which I later made a separate video about. They're a knockoff of Shimano's dual symmetric pivot design of brakes, which I was really interested to test out. However, I unfortunately discovered that this old bike was incompatible with these newer brakes because the reach distance was not long enough. At the time I really had my heart set on upgrading this bike to dual symmetric pivot brakes like these, but from what I could find online, nobody makes these brakes with a reach distance that is long enough for this bike. The best alternative to dual symmetric pivot brakes are their predecessor, which are called dual pivot brakes. As the naming convention suggests, this older design is asymmetric since one arm pivots from this point down here and the other pivots from this main center pivot. According to Shimano, this design of brakes is 36% less effective than its symmetric successor, but they still provide improved braking over the older design known as Side Pull Caliper Brakes, like my bike currently has installed on it. Fortunately, they do sell dual pivot brakes which are long reach and should be compatible with my older era bike. One model that's available is Tektro's R559. So at one point I had ambitions of purchasing a set of these brakes, but it never ended up happening. Considering this bike is my secondary bike, the price for a new set of brakes seemed higher than I wanted to spend on it. So I just continued to ride the bike as it was, until one day I was very lucky to find these brakes, which someone had discarded. These are dual pivot brakes which come from a brand of folding bikes called Brompton, and from what I can tell, their reach seems to be long enough to be suitable for my bike. However, in their current state they don't move freely or smoothly at all, which is likely why they were thrown away by their previous owner. Let's see if I can fix them up. The first pivot comes apart using a 5mm Allen key and a 10mm socket. The main pivot can then be disassembled in a similar way. I also removed the brake pads and gave all the parts a thorough cleaning with a rag. To help ensure I reassemble everything correctly, I only did one brake at a time and used the other as a reference. After carefully getting the tension of the two pivots set correctly, I'm quite pleased with the result. So now I'm getting ready to install these brakes onto the bike, and I've encountered a couple of challenges. Let me show you what I mean over here at the front of the bike. So I can start by removing the old brakes by removing this nut here, which takes a 10mm socket. So now if I slide this other brake into that same hole there, you'll see that just like I had been hoping, the reach distance of these brakes is exactly what I need for this bike. This pad ends up very nicely centered on the rim here, and I have lots of adjustment in either direction to get it exactly right. However, if I rotate the forks this way, you'll see that the bolt for this brake just barely sticks out over here, and there's not enough thread sticking out to securely hold it in place with a nut. And that's after I've already removed all these spacers. However, if I compare the bolt on that brake to the other brake from the same pair, I find that the other bolt is longer. So now if I install the brake with the longer bolt on here, you'll see that there are lots of threads sticking out. And if I were to reinstall these spacers back onto there, the amount of thread sticking out would be very similar to how it was on these old brakes before I removed them. It's common for brakes to be sold this way, and typically the one with the longer bolt is meant for the front, and the one with the shorter bolt is meant for the rear. On this Linear Recumbent bike, however, the back brakes are different than on a conventional bike. The bolt for these brakes needs to be quite long because it needs to go all the way from here, through this gold spacer here, through this block here, all the way to the inside of the frame there where it gets nutted on. Now, having worked on this bike before, I've compared the brakes on both the front and the rear, and I'm pretty sure that the bolt on the rear is just as long as the one on the front, and I wouldn't be surprised that when they were building this bike, they actually had to purchase two front brakes to be able to accommodate that extra distance needed on the back. So I've looked online, and it looks like I should be able to buy a bolt like this, which I could install into these brakes, and I could essentially convert these from rear brakes to front brakes. Another option would be to install the brakes onto the bike using one of these things, which is called a sleeve nut. The way that these work is they fasten onto the end of the thread just like a regular nut would, but as you tighten them, they actually get pulled inside of the hole, so they're still able to get lots of thread engagement. This is something that I'm considering for these front brakes here, but it would mean drilling this hole here bigger to be able to accept this nut, which is something that I'm not sure I'm ready to commit to quite yet. So my plan is that I'm going to install the brake with the longer bolt onto the back of the bike. Then I can give it a test ride and see if I like it or not before I start worrying about the front brake. Before I do that, however, I have one other note on compatibility. Notice how the configuration of this brake here on the back has the cable coming from down here and then going across and getting fastened up here. Now if we compare that to the front brake on this bike, you'll see that the cable comes in here from the top and it comes down here and the cable gets fastened down here. So in other words, it's the opposite. I believe these brakes that came on this bike are actually reversible so that you can configure them in either orientation, but this is the much more common way to see these style of side pull caliper brakes. Now if I look at that same detail on these other brakes, I can see that the cable is designed to come in from the bottom on both of the brakes. I think that probably has something to do with the fact that these are designed for a folding bike, and the way that they want to have their cables routed is different than on a conventional bike. Unlike my other brakes, since this part here is cast in place for accepting the cable housing, I don't think it would be very easy to be able to reverse these. But anyway, that shouldn't pose any challenges here on the back of the bike, since the cable is already routed that way. On the front of the bike this won't be ideal, but I should be able to get a longer piece of cable housing and route it in such a way that it comes down here and back up this way. But anyway, I'm going to get started installing these onto the back, and the first step is to remove the rear wheel. So if I look down here, that's the nut that holds the rear brakes onto this bike. So with not too much difficulty, I was able to get that nut off and also the little washer that was behind it. So now with that nut removed, I can pull these brakes off. This gold piece here would normally be a separate loose piece, but since I'm using it as a mount for holding my fenders with this hose clamp, it's going to stay there in place for now. Alright, so now I'll install the newer ones onto here. So I'll put the jaws around here like that, and I'll thread the bolt through the spacer like that, and then I'll continue to thread it through the actual frame like that. Now adding the washer and the nut. So I was able to get that nut tightened down just like it was before, and here you can see the new brake arms in place, and you can see that they're pivoting the way that they're supposed to. So I put the rear wheel back on the bike to take a look and see how things look, and I'm very disappointed to report that although these are long reach brakes, and when I measured and tried them on the front wheel, they did work correctly. Unfortunately on this back wheel, as you can see, they don't quite reach the rim. When I squeeze on them, they're hitting into the tire and they can't reach the rim, and I have these adjusted so that they're in their most extreme position in that direction there. Now I always knew that the rear brakes needed a longer reach than the front ones, just based on where the pads had been fastened on my existing brakes. I thought I was going to be okay though, because when I tested these ones on the front, the pads were kind of in the middle, and I figured there'd be a little bit of extra space for me to move them down, but unfortunately that was not the case. So my plan now is to reinstall this original brake back on the rear. Then I can take this Brompton brake, the one which has the longer bolt, and I can install it on the front of the bike, so at least I'll have an upgraded front brake on this bike. So off camera I got the rear brake restored back to the way that it was. Now I'll move on to working on the front of the bike. So now with that other brake removed from there, I'll take this newer brake with the longer bolt and I'll place one of these spacers on there, and then I'll insert this through the hole. Now I'll insert this other spacer on the other end, followed by this washer, and finally this nut goes on there. So now that I've got these mounted back on the bike, the next step for me is to reposition the brake pads so that they're correctly oriented on the rim here. Now before I do that, I'm actually going to swap this brake pad with the one on the other side, and the reason is because when I set up these brakes, I intended for this brake to go on the back, but now that I'm putting this on the front, the brake pad direction is opposite. So I'm pretty happy with the positioning of these brake pads that I've got set now. So the next step is for me to connect these brakes up with the brake levers, which is done using the brake cable. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the existing brakes on this bike had the cable which came in from the top and connected down here, where these other brakes are designed to have the cable coming from below and fastening up here, so the exact opposite. My original idea had been that I'd get a longer piece of cable housing connected here and make it just come down here like this and enter from the bottom like that. But now that I actually see it in place, I have some concern about how tight this curve has to be, and also the fact that the pedal here gets really close to where this cable goes. One solution would be to route this cable over on the other side of the steering linkage. However, if you turn far to the right, you'll find that that cable gets pinched in there, which will limit how far you're able to turn to the right. It would really be so much easier if these new brakes allowed for cable routing that's the same as the existing ones. As I described earlier, I don't believe these brakes are designed to be reversible in that way, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to reverse them. Going through my bin of spare parts, I found this thing, which just so happens to have the same thread pattern as this hole here. As you can see, this piece here has a hole in it, which just so happens to be a pretty good fit for one of these barrel adjusters. So that means that a piece of cable housing could then go in there, which would connect up with this piece of cable housing here. So that's half of this adapted. Now I just have to figure out a way that I can have the cable so that it connects down here. So unfortunately, I haven't really been able to find a great way of being able to mount the cable directly to the brake. However, one idea that I have is to use one of these bolts which has a hole through it. And so after I've stuck the cable through the hole of the brake, I can stick the cable through the hole in this bolt. Then I can add a few spacers onto it and tighten on a nut. So now with this fastened down here and the cable routed through this top piece here, when I pull on the cable, it applies the brakes. Of course, this is less than ideal, but I still think it's an improvement over having the cable so that it's routed down through the bottom. One thing that I think I should be able to improve though is to be able to make this piece here thread further in, because the threads right now only stop there. But I should be able to add some additional threads on there, which would enable it to at least have this edge here so that it's flush with this one. Alright, so now you can see I've got this piece so that it sits flush with there. I also trimmed the bolts so that I could put a nut on the other side and it wouldn't stick out too far. And I've also taken this piece and trimmed that as well, because before it was sticking out a fair bit of the bottom there. So now I've got the other brakes removed from the end of this cable, which means all I need to do is thread this cable through this hole up here, and then also thread it through the smaller hole down here. Pull on that, place it in there, and the other end of this cable housing needs to go through its correct spot there. And it looks like this cable is going to be long enough, and I won't need to replace it. So now I've placed this piece here, all I have to do is just tighten it on. So with those new brakes installed, I was able to take the bike for a test ride, and I was quite pleased with the result. The front brakes were noticeably improved from how they were before, although on that bike, with the way that the weight's distributed, the front brakes really aren't nearly as important as the back. So in a way, it just kind of made me wish that I had improved the back the way that I had for the front. But hopefully someday I'll be able to find some dual pivot brakes for the rear that will be long enough to accommodate this unusual bike. So the result wasn't quite what I was hoping for, but I hope you enjoyed joining me and following along with this little project. If you watched all the way to the end of this video, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.